me give you an example of what happens when we let science dictate what we believe. At Yellowstone National Park, there is a large mountain ridge. It is composed of quite a number of layers of volcanic rock. Many of these layers contain petrified trees. Some of these giants seem to be growing in position. They're upright. The signpost that was there said that these trees used to grow in a forest about 51 million evolutionary years ago. The first forest was catastrophically buried by a volcanic eruption. Over many, many, many years, a new forest grew on top of the old forest, but it too got wiped out by another volcanic eruption. This story supposedly repeated itself at least 27 times, since there are 27 separate layers of trees. Wow, that was a bunch of pretty unlucky forest, wasn't it? This information was not only presented at Yellowstone, but teachers all over the country picked up on this. Students for years were asked how could they believe the Earth was young when this one ridge alone would represent at least 30,000 to several million years. When that happened, many students had a crack appear in their armor, and many lost trust in the Bible. Ronald Numbers, who grew up in a church environment, was taught to believe in God's creation and the Bible. He tells about grappling with this information in his book. He writes, "I vividly remember the evening I attended an illustrated lecture on the famous sequence of fossil forests in Yellowstone National Park, and then stayed up much of the night with a biologist friend of like mind, first agonizing over, then finally accepting the disturbing likelihood that the Earth was at least 30,000 years old. Having thus decided to follow science rather than Scripture on the question of origins, I quickly, though not painlessly, slid down the proverbial slippery slope toward unbelief." What happened? Ronald Numbers came across information that he was led to believe contradicted the Bible. What should he have done? Stop! He should have stood firm and trusted the Lord. Instead, he quickly reached a compromised position and then threw out his Bible entirely. So what are the options? Remember those questions? The first was, what's the evidence? He probably thought he had the evidence, didn't he? But it wasn't really the evidence that trapped him. Here we have to be really careful. The second question would probably be more appropriate. How much of the conclusion for multiple forests is actual data, and how much is merely interpretation of that data? That is what knocked Ronald Numbers out of the saddle. Yes, there are 27 layers, and yes, there are upright standing trees in those layers. But the rest concerning multiple forests is merely interpretation or just a story about that data. So the question is there another way to interpret the data? Is there another story? About that time that Ronald Numbers was writing his book, I was doing some research with some others concerning the petrified trees at Yellowstone National Park. We noted that the root structure below these trees abruptly terminated. They were broken off. Well, we thought trees don't do well without roots. Therefore, it would be logical to conclude that they were not growing there. We also notice a general lack of typical forest floor cover between the layers. Well, that would point to the idea that there wasn't very much time in between. Other research was indicating the tree ring structure was identical from one layer to the next for many of the layers. That would indicate they were growing at the same time. My conclusion through all this was that there must be a different explanation. That very year, I looked for the old signpost that explained this ridge in terms of multiple catastrophes and multiple forests over long spans of time, but I couldn't find it. So I asked a ranger at the park where it was. He said, well, they removed the sign. When asked why, he said, the events associated with Mount St. Helens seemed to give them a better idea what happened here at Yellowstone than what they had previously taught. Well, see what happened at Mount St. Helens, that a volcano ripped up trees from a single forest and deposited them in Spirit Lake, where they became buried upright in distinct layers as if they were growing at different times. Wow. One observable event like Mount St. Helens occurs, and all the old interpretations of the data are turned upside down. Remember, interpretations of science are always changing. Theories come and go. Ronald Number was heading in the right direction. But a wrong interpretation of science grabbed him by the back of the neck and sent him wandering into the wilderness. Even while he was publishing his book, though, science did him a nasty disservice. When he wasn't looking, science all of a sudden came up with a new theory and left him wandering in the wilderness. This new theory is much closer to a view that fully fits with the flood account and the aftermaths of that flood. Ronald Numbers didn't need to compromise with the changing world of science. He should have stopped. It is amazing how we could learn so much from just one little volcano. It doesn't take long to get what appears to be multiple forests of trees. It doesn't take millions of years to get extensive geologic layers or erode enormous canyons. It can happen in a minute if the conditions are just right.